Now, more on the weather and climate facts versus global warming narratives. And this time, let's look at rainfall. With bad floods over the past couple of years, we've had countless people in the media, in politics, activists and even some scientists blaming the floods on climate change, citing them as evidence climate change is happening in the here and now and describing them as worse than ever before or unprecedented. The trouble is the facts, the science, doesn't support this narrative. I've shown you before how the only record flood level in recent years was one of the floods in Lismore, and even that was without record rainfall in the catchment. And of course, this summer has seen the culmination of a big flood in the Murray, the first for a long while. I've got to say, I drove along the Murray and the Murrumbidgee and stopped in at Renmark and Mildura during the break, and it was terrific to see the river in flood. Now, that's not to downplay the hardship for businesses and farmers and shack owners, some of whom are good friends of mine. That's all tough. But for the environment, this flood of the Murray-Darling Basin has been a lifeblood. It'll recharge these waterways and backwaters for years to come. And the locals all welcome that. But importantly, again, it's not a record flood. It's been about the 1974 level and well below 1956. So don't try to pretend this is worse. When it is worse, when there is a new record set, well, then we can deal in those facts. But for now, the reality is that this was a big Murray flood, but nothing new, nothing unprecedented or foreboding. The Weather Bureau's own annual summary for Australia confirms much of this when it comes to rainfall. It was a wet year, but it was only the 9th wettest year on record in Australia. That, in other words, about the top 10%. And for the flood-stricken east of Australia, according to this graph supplied by our next guest, rainfall has been the 6th highest on record, with wetter years back in the 50s and 60s. None of this is to downplay the trauma of natural disasters. On the lower Murray, in the Kimberley now and in Queensland, the challenge continues. But let's accurately report the data. Let's not generate hysteria or promote an ideological agenda by spinning the data. Dr. Jennifer Marohasy is a biologist who has relentlessly and forensically analysed how weather records are taken and presented in this country. And she joins me now live from Queensland. Thanks for joining us again, Jennifer. Tell us firstly about your observations and the official data, what they tell us about 2022. It was a very wet year, but nowhere near the wettest.
It was a wet year, but the reality is Australia has always been, it is and has always been a land of drought or flooding rains. And last year was a year of flooding rains, but as you said, not unprecedented, not the worst on record. Now, the flood drought cycles tend to follow changes in the air pressure systems across the Pacific, which are measured by the SOI. And we've heard a lot about La Nina, which is usually when you have a high SOI value. And last year we had a fairly high SOI, not unprecedented, but fairly high. But I think it was exacerbated by the eruption of that Tongan volcano on the 15th of January, spewing a lot of ash and water into the atmosphere, and that exacerbated the flooding. But if you do look, and you showed the chart before, where 2022 fitted relative to, and this is the official record, back to 1900, it was the 6th wettest. So the wettest on record is still 1950. The second wettest, 2010. Now, 2010 was just 3 years after 2007, when we had Tim Flannery telling us that the dams would never fill again because of climate change, that it would never flood again. That was April 2007. By December 2010, it was raining so much over Brisbane. Then we had the dam release flood created by the emergency release of water from Wivenhoe Dam in January 2011. 2010 comes in as the second wettest, third wettest, 1956. And as you said, a lot of flooding along the Murray-Darling back in 1956, also in December last year. But the flood, sorry?
It's so typical, isn't it? That's the cycle. We get a long drought or a bad drought, and it's usually followed by those flooding rains. It's brilliant for the environment, and that's not to downplay the hardship it causes for us in our settlements, but the environment desperately needs these floods, especially inland through the Murray-Darling Basin, doesn't it?
That's right. So we've got aquifer recharge. I mean, we were told that the water was never going to actually get down to the bottom of the Murray because of all the rice growing and the cotton growing upstream. The reality is that, natural variations in climate just trump anything that we do and try and do. Sure, you can mitigate downstream flooding through appropriate management of dams if you've got good seasonal rainfall forecasting, but the Bureau can't even seasonal rainfall forecast, so we don't actually have appropriate management of dams. As I said before, in the case of Wivenhoe and the January 2011 flooding, that shouldn't have happened had there been a good seasonal forecast and appropriate management of that dam.
Indeed. Now, just before I let you go and off rainfall onto temperature, you would have heard my editorial at the start. We had a very cold December across the east coast of Australia. It was preceded by a cold last month of spring in November. Now, the data's there. You can find it on the Bureau of Meteorology website if you look for it. But we have far less focus from the Bureau, let alone the media and others, on these downside records, on these records about the cold. They only want to ever talk about records when it comes to warming or heat, don't they?
So when you say you can find the data on the Bureau's website, the data that's presented in the annual climate report is the homogenised data, and that's actually undergone industrial scale remodelling. So if you look at the raw temperature data for places that still use a mercury thermometer, places like Coonabarabran, you'll actually see that last year was about 1.5 degrees Celsius below average. Now, the Bureau is saying that officially nationwide we're about 0.5 above. I would actually argue about 1.5 below, that's degrees Celsius, if you look at the unhomogenized data, and also if you look at the locations where they're still measuring with a mercury thermometer. Now, I'm going to be in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal on the 3rd of February, just next month, trying to get access to the parallel data, which will give us an idea of what the historical data looks like. Not adjusting
without adjustment, just the raw data.
Equipment.
Just the raw data. Fascinating stuff. I really admire your tenacity on this issue. It's an important one. Thanks again for joining us, Jennifer.
Thanks for the opportunity, Chris.